Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us this evening at our Histories Online series. So this evening's topic is tracking otters in Singapore, repositories, communities, and communication. We are happy to have with us Sivasothi. For those of us who did zoology in NUS or have been active in nature circles, Siva needs no introduction. You can call him one of the cornerstones of the natural history community in Singapore. Known to many as Otterman, he is a senior lecturer at the Department of Biological Sciences at the National University of Singapore. He also coordinates environmental volunteer groups like the Biodiversity Friends Forum and the NUS Toddy Cats, inspiring the next generation of naturalists and conservationists. I will now pass on the session to him. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Very happy to be here with you. Let me begin my slides. As you know, this talk focuses on tracking otters in Singapore, right? But it's referring more to the role that repositories play, right? Role that not just repositories, but also people. So, in the description, it says, is urged to study a furry mammal in his beloved mangrove. So Pat Foster-Turley was chair of the IUCN Otter Specialist Group. This is the group that makes recommendations to the red data list about the status of their group of speciality, in this case being otters. And she had conducted a PhD in Malaysia, field studies, and she had brought a bag of otter sprains, dried otter sprains, to NUS, where she looked for a very famous crab man. This is Peter Ng. So he's the head of the Lee Kong Chian Natural History Museum in NUS now. And he said, otters in Asia really need help. We hardly know anything. So Peter said, okay, I'll look out for people, especially someone who likes mucking about in the mangrove. And yeah, I was an innocent victim of the conspiracy of these two. Pat left with Peter Otter Action Plan in 1990. And I spent a lot of time in mangroves, and I was game for something challenging, right? So I went out to look for otters. Very easy, right? First of all, it was extremely difficult to find them. Extremely difficult. And then secondly, when I did find them, they were very wary of people. So they will keep a distance, right? And then all the field guides that I had, and they weren't very specific in those days, they weren't helpful. And when I look at footprints, I was like, holy cow, what am I looking at? In fact, there's once I tracked footprints along a beach. I think this was in Penang or Perak, and when I finally cornered the animal, it was a poor dog who had been wondering who had been following him for so long. So, oh my God, it was so confusing. And then when you read technical papers available at the time, you can see in the map, they had a different subspecies name for every other shade of fur. So it was extremely confusing. And it meant that when people are making references to animals, it depended on what references they were reading, because they would call an animal under our nose by a completely different name. So there was it was very misleading. So then, I had to refer to repositories, right? So I was singularly fortunate because Singapore, as a colonial outpost of the British Empire, had established a library and museum. This, as you know, was after Raffles had left. And as they built up the library collection, there were invaluable books that were there, which we ultimately inherited. When the library and museum was disassembled after independence, the library collection of zoological literature actually made its way to Central Library in NUS. And then when the Science Library was opened, and this was in 1986, when the building was ready and the books were brought in, they bought in the natural history collection because, it should belong to Science Library, right? So little did people know that this iconic and extremely critical building not only provided a place for science students to study, but beneath them were a repository of invaluable books inherited from a colonial library. And this is where the zoological collection finally found a home. And it was called very, innocuously, the Zoological Reference Collection. I was lucky because I got to know it intimately. My JC girls said, they want some people to help arrange specimens. And I just finished army, so I went there to help. And I was like quite amazed by what I was seeing. Now, the library collection was kept by the science library, so they kept it properly in climate control conditions, but it wasn't catalogued. That would have been a phenomenal task, and it was just KIV. But the zoological staff who would reference it had a key, so we would go down to the library and then access this collection of very dusty books. Masks weren't in vogue, so I never wore one. It would have been really helpful. Now, interestingly, so this I'm just giving you one example. This is Fauna of British India by R.I. Poock. So in the writing, right, of the many references I was reading, right, I'm trying to cross-reference. What do they really mean? Where did the person see it? Was it based on a specimen, or was it just his, impression? And well, these books were around. But interestingly, the volume 1 for Mammalia was missing from the NUS library. And, if it's missing means, how am I going to get my hands on it? The only way would be to look for a used book dealer. There were several shops in the UK where we would order very specific books, but it would have been extremely expensive and taken forever to come. And then to my surprise, it was in the National Library. Yes, the good old brick building, which has disappeared since. And I had to read the book within the collection and very carefully Xerox the pages that I need, right? To which Poock had referred to Otters, and there are not many references. Now, in a contrast, right? This image of the cover page, I got it off my handphone just now. A lot of my photos from this era are on slides. They haven't been digitized, so I desperately looked for online and it appeared. I still can't get over the fact that we have this amount of power at our fingertips today, right? And then the literature was important as well, the what we call gray literature. So the local naturalists in the Nature Society had banded together, and they had a publication called the Pangolin, and ran for about 10 years. And it was extremely invaluable because these were field notes and observations that a very small group of people were making observations of. And you can see on the left, someone called Ray Hiscock sees an otter, and it was sliding down a mud bank, playfully. And on the right, you can see this is, there's actually an error in this image because the SAF officer indicated here is wearing camouflage uniform with boots, right? Actually, he wasn't, he was wearing a number 3. Yeah, but anyway, in his drive around the island, he encountered small claw otters, and that was extremely exciting for us. And what we lacked in photography, then it was made up for by illustrations. And this illustration is made, these were made by Calvin Lim. He's a member of the Vertebrate group in the Nature Society, and he's a curator at the Lee Kong Chian Natural History Museum. So these were extremely invaluable. And I didn't just dig them up from Singapore. I would go to places like Malaysia, go down a dusky corridor and into a room that nobody ventures. And I pulled out volumes of the Journal of Wildlife and National Parks, which Dr. Lim Buliet, an esteemed mammalologist who passed away recently, he had initiated that to capture in a very similar way the experience of the park staff and get them used to writing more technically. And there was invaluable information there. Not a lot on otters, but it gave me an idea of the repositories that were present. And you have to be bold in asking people. So actually, I realized, because I was singular-minded about finding out whether the otters in Singapore and Malaysia, it gave me a purpose and a direction. And when you went to meet people, generally, they were all very supportive. So today, of course, you don't have to go and dig through dusty cupboards. There are a lot of repositories online. And so NUS has actually done a great job of putting together, a lot of these are scanned, digitized. I did my share in the late 90s. In the late 90s, I put the Raffles Bulletin online, right? Because I knew how desperate a student can be when you're searching for information and you don't have the connections or the money to be able to extract it. So we put a version that anyone could download for free. Now, of course, the scanned images are fantastic. The quality is very, very good. So I'm very happy to see that. In fact, the speaker before me, right, Timothy Bernard, he made a reference to Forrester's report in 1900. And he showed a map, and I was like, oh, I definitely must share that map. So I just Googled it. And you can see below, that's just something I shared on Instagram from the repository that I was able to pull up on my handphone. So that and my students have to study this, of course, but it's this easy to pull up. We have the information flowing out of our handphone. It's amazing, right? Now that was the library collection, right? And I must add that the science library didn't have everything, and we would buy from booksellers, secondhand booksellers, and it was very expensive. And we also wrote to people. So there was a taxonomist, a Dutch taxonomist, who I wrote to and said, this is what I'm doing. I'm trying to figure out whether otter species was present in Singapore or Malaysia during a certain time. It was so specific, right? And there was a volume I was after, and it was written in German. But, never fear, use a German-English dictionary and just force your way through word by word. Until you figure out what they are saying, right? But I didn't have access to it. So he couriered 2 critical books, which he sent to Peter, because, I was just some graduate student with no reputation, right? So he couriered it to Peter, and he told Peter, get your student to Xerox it and then courier it back to me. So I stayed overnight in the department, and I'm very handy with the Xerox machine, and I generated a double-sided copy, which I bound, and I made 2 copies, one of which I put in the science library, so that we had those technical volumes. Now, of course, the zoological collection, which we inherited from the Raffles Library and Museum, right, that came to science faculty, and the building which pulled the scattered remains of the collection together was ready in 1987, and that's when it was officially opened. It was ready by 1986, and then I was working there as student assistant, arranging specimens back into the cupboards and being taught how to handle them appropriately by the curators. It was really an excellent education. Then, of course, it shifted to its a large old building of its own in 2014. And I must tell you, you go to a museum to study specimens. You can read about it and see photos and all that, but when you're examining specimens, it just blows your mind. So at that time, I was reading all these accounts about the short-clawed otter and the webbing is incomplete and all that. When I finally looked at it, it just blew my mind, because the difference between the small-clawed otter and the smooth-coated otter, you just can't possibly believe they are hunting the same thing. So even if you find them in parts of Malaysia in the same place, there is a separation of their niche due to the kind of diet they were feeding on from the design of the body. And that's become very apparent today, right? When the smooth-coated otter with the much stronger webbing is a much stronger swimmer, stronger claws, and we know from the diet studies that it's primarily a fish eater, and so that's why they're doing so well in the urban canals, which are full of exotic fish. Right. The other thing that the museum has are skins, and there had been a lot of talk of a hairy-nosed otter, and it's quite obvious to see which is the hairy nose, right? It's the rhinarium. It's completely covered. You don't see a naked nose pad like the other 3 species do, or in a pet cat or dog, right? The hairy nose is actually a hairy-nosed otter. And for a while there, when people were discussing the species, there was a time when some people didn't believe the species existed, So this photo, which was a slide, just completely threw them. You're like, all right, okay, there's a hairy-nosed otter. And then there were other features of the fur. Now, color doesn't always stay well, so it's the hard characters which are very useful. So a close examination of the skull, the dentition, the morphology of the teeth, afforded some information. It's not so easy when you're separating between otter species, but it's very easy when you're separating between other carnivore species. So, okay, I could take a deep breath. It wasn't so out of hand. The 16 pages of synonymies, right, were resolved. Actually, the year I was born in 1966. It was one of the books that the Dutch taxonomist had sent me, and when I read through all of his work, he was just an amateur naturalist. He sat in the museum for days and days and days, and then resolved all of those synonymies. So it was really a godsend. And using that and all the other information I found out from the close examination of the species, by seeing what people write about, I realized, okay, relax, it's just 4 species. Then we did this. So this is Calvin helping me drawings again. And you can see the focus is on a silhouette, because remember, I was just seeing shadowy figures at dawn, right? Or dusk. In fact, they were more active nocturnally than diurnally. So what would they appear like? Right, and a close examination of the skull, and I discovered to my delight that there were smooth-coated otters at Zoo Negara. These were extremely rare to be in a zoo collection. Everywhere I looked, friends travel overseas, they'll take photos when they go to the zoo. Hey, I saw otter. Some of them will send it to me. Can you imagine? These were 3R prints that they put in an envelope and sent to me, right? So they saw it in Washington, in Australia, and all kind of places. Every time it came back, it was the Asian small-clawed otter. The husbandry was well known. They are small species that live in a group, so very attractive to import, and they were everywhere in zoos. But Zoo Negara somehow had smooth-coated otters, and when I was told, I went down and I just sat there and watched them for hours, right? So I think I went there for 3 days, and I just went to the otter enclosure, and I was trying to burn a search image in my mind. So in NUS, I never really had close supervision. The way I supervised my students, right? I had conversations, and you can learn so much from the conversations if you're good at living off secondhand experience. And this is Prof. D.H. Murphy and Dr. Jon Sigurdsson. They both passed on quite recently in the last 5 years. And the corridor conversations that we had were phenomenal because they had read so widely about everything. So they won't just talk about an insect in a mangrove. They might talk about the village people who used to stay there, how things had changed. They've been around since the 60s. So there was a lot of information they're able to transfer from just conversations. And the same thing happened when I started doing the otter work. I found it so important to track people down because you can learn only so much from reading the books and looking at the specimen. There is plenty that is missing, especially if the scientists did not keep a field naturalist notebook. This is a tradition which was initiated to great detail in Berkeley. So if you go to the museum there, they also have all these books written by the naturalists who went out to do very specific detailed field notes. In lieu of that, the conversations that you're able to score by hunting people down. So you must be single-minded. You mustn't be so shy. So Peter Ng, when he was a student, he didn't really have supervision as well. I mean, he was studying crabs. Nobody was studying crabs. So he just hunted people down and wrote letters, and he tapped the world leaders in taxonomy to help him understand the science. So he was always saying, yeah, go and write to this guy and, be shameless and all that. And so amongst the people I tracked down, this was Prof. Sasi Kumar, Dr. Lim Buliat. Dr. Lim Buliat is a legend in mammal circles, and Sasi Kumar is the same way for mangroves. So these were people I met Prof. Sasi Kumar I met at a meeting that I was just sent for. I didn't even know what the meeting was about. And then I figured out it was something about mangroves. And I talked to him and he was amazing, right? And Dr. Lim Buliat actually hunted down in his house. So we talked about otters for about 2 hours, and then we talked about politics in Malaysia for 3 hours and at a Sarabat store under a big tree. These are phenomenal memories. You're not going to get this just out of a book, right? So of course, it's good that I'm a student, and because I got to generate an end product, and that's a TC. So right now, the Otter Watchers, when they help my students around, they're very pleased because when the deadline comes, then they have to submit a completed work, right? And this completed work is available, right, in the library, and then ultimately you convert some of it at least to technical papers, which are available as PDFs. So this is quite a critical part of the process of science. So everybody helps you know that they are contributing in some way to a larger body of work, which helps us in our understanding of science and in conservation. So, IUCN, remember Pat Foster-Turley was the chair of this group, and it's now Nico Duplay, and they put together this very simple graphic so that people know what species are present in their part of the world. There are 13 species worldwide. There are 4 species in Asia. And interestingly, there's only 3 in Malaysia. How come there's no Eurasian otter? And that's very interesting. So the case of the Eurasian otter, is explained in the thesis and the paper. And, there's a conclusion that there's no record of the presence of Lutra barang in Peninsular Malaysia. Some people say, oh, it must be extinct. Some people say it used to be in the mountains. And when I traced down all of that, I realized that error came out because Medway listed it in his book. Right? Yeah, he has a list of mammals for Peninsular Malaysia. And in 1983, they updated it, the second edition, Peninsular Malaysia in Singapore. And it says that there is, the otter is present, right? But there's a little footnote, right? There's a reference. And if you follow the reference, he's referring to a paper by Flower. And Flower is referring to a specimen by Abbott that was found in December of 1899. And unfortunately, I thought it might be in the Smithsonian Institution, but I was not sure. I didn't even know who to write to. The names that I knew, they had all passed away already. And anyway, I had no money to go to the US, right? I would finally go to the Smithsonian, it would be like 20 years later. So thankfully, a mollusk graduate student, Dr. Tang Ko Siang at the Tropical Marine Science Institute now, and then he was a graduate student. So he had cobbled together money from a grant and I think from his own pocket, and he had made it to the Smithsonian, and he went to he was at the mollusk collection and he asked his host, can I go and look at the mammal collection? And it's for a specific purpose. So when you have a specific purpose argument written out, right, and you explain it, people will support it. What they won't entertain is just general requests, because usually they are too busy and they're overwhelmed, right? There's someone who taught me that lesson. I'll tell you later, right? So it turned out that the Eurasian otter there was never evidence for it in Malaysia. This advice, right, about getting information from people extremely busy or might not want to entertain you by being very specific. It came from Douglas Brandon Jones. So Douglas Brandon Jones published this paper, a revision of pied-leaf monkeys, in the Raffles Bulletin of Zoology in the mid-90s. I think this is 1995. And he told me, right, when you write to museum curators, be very specific in what you need. So I wrote to, I think it was Daphne Hill, at the Natural History Museum in London, right? And I wrote a summary at the top to say, look, I need to know the records of otters you have in your museum. Then I wrote the long story, and some people might remember aerograms. Aerograms are blue sheets of paper, which you paid a fixed price for, and then you could fold it up, and it's very light, and then you send it off by airmail. And when I wrote that very detailed explanation of what I was up to, and I sent it to her, there was an amazing response. She reorganized the whole collection. It was in a bit of a mess, so she sorted out, reorganized all the labels, and was able to send me the updated catalog, which turned out to be quite critical to answer other questions that we had at the time. Right? So, okay, you do all this work, so what can you say? Right? And then this is a story I tell people nowadays, but it rests on a body of work that we had to conduct using the repositories and with a limited amount of field work, right? And so we know for Singapore, otters were present in the primeval past. So there is records in the 19th century, but the landscape changed, right? So we see all this very drastic transformation with independence. So from last week's lecture by Timothy Bernard, and he says, look, 1900, almost everything was gone. But then they tried to grow the forest back, and some amount of green patches are present. And then with independence, there's reclamation, there are more reservoirs being formed. And so landscape takes a beating, right? So for otter habitats, this is not a good situation, and so we tend to see the loss of records for otters. Right, the last reference to it is actually by Bernard Harrison is very famous, right? But his father was a professor of zoology and he wrote a book. And he says we still see otters occasionally. And this was in the mid-60s, around the time I was born. Then by the 70s, the records are gone. There are occasional visits from across the Johor Straits, but generally a lot of habitats are lost. And if you look at Singapore today, we have forest streams, right? Then outside of the forest is all urbanized canals. And then the coastline is reclaimed. So that would have pushed away a lot of animals, right? Now, of the two species, the small-clawed otter and the smooth-coated otter, the smooth-coated otter is bigger, able to eat fish. So we were hoping that, maybe it can recover, right? Because after the 80s, right, with the Garden City movement, with the cleaning of the water so that we are drinking water from our reservoirs, and the Four Visions, right, which is now in its city in nature phase, surely all of this might prove that the habitat is attractive to otters from southern Malaysia. And although the patches are small, they are connected, right? There's a network of connections which they can use. And the reservoirs that are clean also provide a connectivity into the heart of Singapore. So there seems to be like a niche, but it's empty. Now you must realize that the rivers then, they were squalid, people use as dumping ground. And then now it's so clean. So I was from St. Andrew's School, and if the ball bounces into the Kallang River, like, oh no, because it's completely black, right? In fact, my friend who's a heritage blogger, right, Lam Chan Si said, he stayed in Ponong Pasir and they call it Dead Chicken River. Well, in a flood, you might see dead pigs as well. So not really hospitable. But as we converted the waterways back, it's a completely different environment, and a lot of alien freshwater fish are doing very well. So my friends in the freshwater lab, they'll give a talk in the series, and you see a lot of alien species, right? But the good thing is a lot of these alien fish are nice, big, fat, juicy, and just nice for smooth-coated otters. Not so good for small-clawed, but great for the fish-eating smooth-coated otter. And then, there are fishermen who are quite excited about what you can get in canalized waterways and reservoirs, right? Our native fish are confined in the forest. So that's why everyone talks about doing any kind of development works in the forest. We're like, hey, no, not so easy. And then we have these engagement process to try to ensure there's no impact on forest streams. But the canals, lot of stuff, right? And these have been documented. And you can see Kelvin's name is here, right? Along with Hyok Kui. So they have collaborated with us on working with what otters eat. And, because the smooth-coated otters are doing quite well, they're quite habituated. They're not going to run away if they see you like what I was experiencing in Malaysia. My most recent student, Tina, who was working on otters for honours thesis, actually tried. She said, can we figure out what they're eating just by taking photographs? And she has a little camera which can take pretty distant shots, and it turned out it was really working. So this is amazing. From the time when, of course, we are backed up by ichthyologists who can identify the species. So, canalized rivers for flood control, not very hospitable, but naturalized canal, wow. So the otters are using the adjacent banks to dry themselves off. There's riparian vegetation to hide in, right? So this is very important. And, at that time when you're doing the study in 1994, you say, hey, the environment is clean, there's space, there's food, surely they'll come back, and amazingly. So we have actually Johor the Tank. While we are going through this development stage, then they were not really facing development. So there were many habitats which otters were able to function in. And occasionally they come and visit, and eventually they took up permanent residence in Sungai Buloh. And then, we saw them Ubin and Tekong. And we started appealing for records, and people would supply. And this is what we use to track otters in a modern era. And then we even use Facebook when it became available. So now I had a student, Meryl, who was tracking them very intently. And, the otters were more adaptable to urban habitats than we imagine. Remember, there's me tracking otters in the dark, making sure they can't smell me, not using a torchlight to not chase them away, and then seeing them do this in front of me. This was me, the handphone camera, watching them be so comfortable in Singapore. And even in built-up areas, we realize under bridges and all that, there are a lot of places where there's a bit of salt, hard surface, and then they can rub and dry their skin. They're not waterproof, so if they are moist all the time, it's detrimental. And look at them using these resting spaces under a bridge. I had sat there, right, and we knew the otters would come by, right, and they just ignored me. So I was keeping quite still, and they did look at me, but then they went about their business. So they are quite habituated, and the populations gradually start to use up the space. Until February 2014, Ahwat was seen in Gardens by the Bay. Then we realized he had a girlfriend, and pups were coming up, right? So these photos have made Singapore world famous for how the city is trying to coexist with nature. And we do this census. So Max, another student, also starts with M. So the Otter Watchers love my students when the name begins with M. They'll do a good job, right? We map the population number, and we are doing the census again to figure out how many the environment can support. And of course, when there's a limit to support, other animals die, right? They can't compete. Okay, so we do have some problems. The habitats are fragmented, so you might get roadkill, and we do pick up carcasses. Now we send it to the zoo, WRS, for autopsy so that we understand what's going on. And it's not just happening to otters, it's happening to many animals. So although we are quite a green city, right, the habitats are fragmented. And then when we compile records that everyone is keeping, we realize, whoa, there's a lot of deaths around our central catchment, which is the most important forest, and along the coast, right? So now we're trying to figure out how to solve this, right, more effectively. And as we handle all the various problems with otters on a daily basis, right, which is done by Otter Working Group, which is made up of naturalists, just members of public who follow them every day, feeders with information through WhatsApp. There's the vets at the zoo, the wildlife charity Acres, who does rescue, MPAC, who are the managers, myself and other researchers in universities. We've put a decision tree, right? We came together, put a decision tree together on how we will handle urban otters. Now, the thing is, we consulted international experts, right? And then we realized Singapore is quite unique in what we are facing. So we have to be the ones that share it and say, okay, this is what we figure out. This might happen to you soon, right? So people generally, they love otters. I mean, just compared to their comments about the poor long-tailed macaque. And we have habituated families. So it's like really a reward for working to keep the environment clean. Right, so we sometimes why they love otters so much, compared to say long-tailed macaque or civets and all that. It's a mystery to be solved. Now the thing is, although the smooth-coated otter, the fish eater, is doing well, not so much for the small clawed. That one is more vulnerable. So the mangrove rehabilitation work that's going on at Pulau Ubin, very important, right? And guess what? Klang River in Malaysia, clean enough, supporting fish, smooth-coated otter is returning. So it's really, really exciting. We talk to the Malaysians, and we share notes, and it's really an opportunity to learn about otter ecology. Now, we ask simple questions, students do research, we make sure we publish some of it, we share stories on Facebook groups, and if you find the right partner, they'll dress up as an otter and parade around and excite children and get them to know the issues. So here, Max, my student, is explaining to DPM, right, Theo, what is an otter, how come there are this many species, and what is carrying capacity, very important. So you don't have to freak out when you think otters are going to reproduce, right? And, cartoons have been produced. So it's really, really great that the work of conservation is now a shared property between agencies, charities, NGOs, and the public alike. And I'm really glad you're here to hear these stories, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thanks, everyone.